Welcome back. In this next section we're going to cover common defense mechanisms, and these are defense mechanisms that can be used by people in general, but especially in this case by addicts, and they are mechanisms used to protect something, which in this case is to protect the addict's addiction and their behavior. So it's broken up into three different categories, those being primitive defense mechanisms, then less primitive and more mature, and then lastly mature defense mechanisms. So the first of these and most primitive of all defense mechanisms is denial. And that's probably the most commonly used term and most well-known term in association with addiction. And that's really because most addicts don't want to acknowledge they have a problem, because then they're going to have to stop and they're going to have to look for help in order to stay stopped. So on a simple level, denial is an inability to differentiate the true from the false, to accept reality. And so it's not surprising that when confronted about their addiction, addicts will give many excuses, justifications, rationalizations. They will blame others for their behavior, their usage, and the resulting behavior and consequences. Because really the bottom line is that they know deep down inside that if they acknowledge they have a problem, firstly, they'll have to stop drinking, using, or acting on whatever other addictive behavior. And then secondly, they will have to seek help and really have to facilitate some form of recovery in order to stay stopped. And this can be a very terrifying proposition to an addict, especially when it becomes the only thing that they really know. So really the first steps in helping an addict to achieve recovery is breaking through this denial. Next of these is regression. And regression simply is a reversion back to an earlier stage of development in the face of unacceptable thoughts or impulses. So an example of this would be if an adolescent were to be faced with overwhelming fear, anger, or maybe sexual impulses. They could regress back to an earlier stage of their childhood, exhibiting behaviors that they may have long since overcome, like clinginess or maybe even bedwetting. So an adult who was under extreme stress, for example, could regress and start refusing to get out of bed and to get up and continue with normal everyday activities. Okay, acting out, which is really a common one in addiction, is when a person acts out on extreme behavior to express thoughts or feelings that they cannot otherwise express. So for example, an addict who's confronted by somebody, rather than just saying, "I'm angry with you," could act out by throwing a book at them, or maybe breaking a door and slamming it, or punching a wall, that kind of thing, and then afterwards would feel a sense of relief and then must return to a state of peace and calm. Very similarly to how a child would act out throwing a temper tantrum when they don't get their way with their parent. Self-harm is also a form of acting out, where a person would express through physical pain what they cannot stand to feel emotionally. So I guess what's important to stay here, especially when it comes to addiction and similarly to regression that we discussed before, is that when addicts start using drugs and alcohol, they tend to stop maturing emotionally, and they are often ill-equipped with the tools to deal with life's problems on life's terms. So they will revert to very childlike behavior and ways of dealing with these problems. Next is dissociation. And dissociation is where a person can lose track of time, themselves, and even their normal thought patterns and memories, and create a different representation of themselves to continue on in the moment. People who suffer from child abuse or even sexual abuse will often suffer from dissociation, and in extreme cases can even create multiple selves, as in multiple personality disorder. People who suffer from dissociation will disconnect from their real world, and their own self-image will not flow continuously. They'll create a different world that they can exist in, that is not as cluttered with unwanted thoughts, feelings, or memories that they find unbearable. Compartmentalization, which is a lesser form of dissociation, is where parts of oneself are kept separate from awareness of other parts, while behaving as if we have two separate sets of values. So an example would be if a man was an honest man and claimed to be an honest man and live an honest life, then cheats on his tax return, but keeps these two sets of values separate and distinct, while remaining completely unconscious of the cognitive dissonance. Projection, which is another common one, is where one person projects their own thoughts, feelings, motivations, or impulses onto another person. A good example of this would be if two people were in treatment together and one is accusing the other for coming into treatment with an ulterior motive, when in fact it is them that have come into treatment with an ulterior motive and they may be feeling guilty about that. So it's usually due to a lack of insight or acknowledgement of one's own true feelings or motivations. Reaction formation is where a person who's experiencing unwanted thoughts or feelings tries to convert them into the opposite. So example would be a woman who's at work and is very angry with her boss and very unhappy in her job. Instead acts overly kind and generous towards her boss and expresses a desire to want to work there forever. So instead of addressing her anger and unhappiness, she instead is overly kind and generous to publicly demonstrate her lack of unhappiness and anger. Okay, the next are less primitive and more mature defense mechanisms, and these are used by many adults. And although they might work for some people, they're not really effective ways of dealing with feelings, anxiety, or stress. So if you spot that you are using some of these, don't feel bad, because almost everybody does. Okay, repression is an unconscious blocking of feelings, thoughts, memories, and even impulses. And the key word is unconscious, because we don't do it on purpose, and most people have very little control over it whatsoever. So a repressed memory would be a memory that is blocked from access or view. And because memory is malleable and ever-changing, we can't view it like a DVD of our lives. The DVD is filtered and can even be altered by our experiences in life, or even things that we've read or viewed. Displacement is a redirection of thoughts or feelings from one person or object onto another person or object. And displacement is really used when people cannot safely express their true feelings towards one person or object through fear of possible consequences. So a good example would be is if a man is really angry towards his boss, but cannot express that anger due to fear of being fired, then comes home and kicks the dog and takes his frustration out on his wife. So although this is a commonly used defense mechanism, it's very ineffective, as all it really does is enables us to take out our frustrations on harmless people or objects, and really just creates more problems in our lives. Another common one, intellectualization, is when we place an overemphasis on thinking when confronted with an unacceptable or uncomfortable situation, feelings, or thoughts, so that we can then distance ourselves from the emotional or human context. So a good example would be if a man was told that he was terminally ill and he's going to die, rather than feel the feelings of fear and probably grief, they would then intellectualize the situation and start focusing more on thoughts of possible medical procedures or any other kind of solutions they could find to the problem, so that they could move away from any of the uncomfortable feelings that should accompany that situation. So we see this a lot in addiction, especially you'll notice when people first clean up and go through detox, almost immediately they start to feel better and will be walking around as if nothing happened. And that is because as a defense mechanism, rather than feel what should be years worth of guilt and shame and remorse and hurt for the things that they've done and have been through, they will intellectualize the process and focus more on therapy and work and all the rest of that kind of stuff, so that they don't have to let any of that emotion in. Because if they were to truly feel how they should feel, if they had any connection to that, is they would be walking around in a mess most of the time. Rationalization, which is quite common in addiction and is really a form of denial, is where a person tries to offer a different light or point of view or perspective on the current situation so that they can feel a sense of comfort with what they're about to do or are currently doing. So we know that when addicts are using drugs and doing the things that they need to do in order to use drugs, they will constantly be trying to rationalize the situation so that they don't feel as bad. Because in a vague way, they do sense that what they're doing is wrong. They do know what they're doing is going to negatively impact themselves and others, but they have to offer themselves all kinds of plausible explanations so that they can still feel okay with what they're doing on an intellectual level. So a good example of this would be as if an addict was to be planning to spend their rent money on drugs. They could then know in a vague way this is not a good idea, and that the wife probably not very happy with this, and people would judge them for that action. They could rationalize that then by saying, but I could be making some money next week, or I could use that money to pay the rent, and then that would sort this problem out, and I just don't need to tell anybody. So rationalizing the situation so that they can feel comfortable with then going out and spending that rent money. Another good example is where addicts will often say, well, me drinking and using is really only affecting me, it's not affecting the people around me. And they'll rationalize this by saying, well, as long as I'm not harming anybody else and it's just me who's doing the damage to my own body and life, that's okay. But that's not really reality, because in a vague way they will know that what they're doing is going to have an impact on the people around them, and that their actions are harming others. While mom is lying awake at night wondering where you are, that is negatively impacting her. But they'll try and offer themselves plausible but untrue reasons for the things that they're doing, so that they don't have to feel the guilt and the shame for what they're doing. Undoing, which is an attempt to undo or take back an unconscious behavior or thought that might be unacceptable or hurtful. So if, for example, somebody realizes that they've just insulted their significant other with a comment, they might spend the next hour trying to praise their beauty, their charm, and intellect. So by undoing the previous action, they feel they might be counteracting the damage done by the original comment, and that then hopefully the two will balance each other out. Mature defense mechanisms are obviously far more constructive and useful to us as adults, although they do require a lot of time and practice in order to achieve. These defense mechanisms help us to become a more productive and constructive component of our environments, and you'll find that people who use mature defense mechanisms are usually much more at peace and ease with themselves and with people around them. The first of these is sublimation, and this is where we try to channel unacceptable or unwanted thoughts, feelings, or emotions into more acceptable, maybe constructive and productive ones. So, for example, if someone's experiencing some sexual impulses that they do not want to act on for whatever reason, they could channel this into doing some rigorous exercise. So that way, challenging energy that would otherwise be lost or detrimental into doing something that is useful and positive and constructive. Compensation is really an attempt to psychologically counterbalance one's perceived weaknesses by focusing on some of their strengths in other areas instead. So if, for example, somebody said, I'm really no good at being able to fix a car, but I'm really good at fixing computers, they are then compensating for their lack of skills in fixing the car by focusing on their strengths in being able to fix a computer. Now, when compensation is appropriately used and not in an attempt to overcompensate, it helps to reinforce one's self-esteem and self-image. Assertiveness is the emphasis of one's own thoughts or feelings or needs in a manner that is respectful yet direct and firm. So most communication skills exist in a continuum, and they range between passive and aggressive, whereas assertiveness sits neatly in between the two. People who are passive, as we've discussed earlier, are good listeners. They have the ability to listen empathetically to what people are saying to them, but they lack the ability to stick up for themselves when they need to. Whereas aggressive people can be good leaders. but they unfortunately lack the ability to be able to listen empathetically to what people are saying to them. So assertiveness is, or strikes, a nice balance in between the two, where a person is able to speak up with their opinions and their beliefs, but in a manner that is respectful yet firm and direct. So they make good leaders, but at the same time they are able to listen to what people are saying to them. So assertiveness is really one of the most sought after of all communication skills, because people know it is the most effective and brings about the most benefit.